Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Wednesday, March 4th, 2026. 6 U.S. soldiers have been killed as the war with Iran further engulfs the region. Plumes of smoke from 2 simultaneous strikes rise over Tehran, Iran, Monday, March 2nd, 2026. The war over Iran engulfed more of the Middle East on Monday as strikes intensified. Iran-backed groups stepped up attacks, and 6 U.S. service members was killed in action. Trump has said his administration expects the conflict to go on for 4 to 5 weeks, but we have capability to go far longer than that. The Iranian Red Crescent Society, a humanitarian organization, said at least 555 Iranians have been killed since the beginning of the joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign on Saturday. They include Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and members of his family. Iranian officials also said more than 168 schoolgirls were killed in a direct hit on a school. Here are more of the key updates NPR is reporting on. U.S. casualties. U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, said Monday that 6 U.S. service members died during Iran's initial attacks in response to U.S. and Israeli strikes across Iran Saturday. The U.S. official, not authorized to speak publicly, told NPR that the troops who were killed were ground-based forces stationed in Kuwait. The soldiers identified are not being released until at least 24 hours after their families have been notified, CENTCOM said. We expect to take additional losses, and as always, we will work to minimize losses. General Dan Kane, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said on Monday. President Trump on Sunday had pledged that the U.S. would avenge the deaths of American troops. In a separate incident, CENTCOM said 3 U.S. F-15E fighter jets crashed in Kuwait due to an apparent friendly fire incident Sunday night. During active combat that included attacks from Iranian aircraft, ballistic missiles, and drones, the U.S. Air Force fighter jets were mistakenly shot down by Kuwait air defenses, it said in a statement. CENTCOM said all 6 members of the crew were ejected safely, have been safely recovered, and are in stable condition. It added that Kuwait acknowledged the incident and said that the cause of the incident is under investigation. Meanwhile, the Iranian Red Crescent Society, a humanitarian organization, said at least 555 Iranians have been killed since the beginning of U.S. and Israeli attacks on Saturday. They include Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and members of his family. Iranian officials have said more than 168 schoolgirls were killed in a direct hit on a school. White House objectives. President Trump said on Monday that the White House has 4 objectives in attacking Iran: to stop the country from producing new missiles, eliminate its navy, prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon, and make it so Iran cannot continue to arm, fund, and direct terrorist armies outside of their borders. He called Iran the world's #1 sponsor of terror, but said he thought the U.S. and Iran would be able to negotiate. We thought we had a deal. and they backed out. I said, "You can't deal with these people. You got to do it the right way." Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the attacks needed to happen, while Iran was weakened. "We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action." Rubio said, "We knew that they would precipitate an attack against American forces, and we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties." Lebanon. Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group in Lebanon, said it launched attacks in Israel in revenge for the killing of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah, as well as in response to continued Israeli attacks in Lebanon since a ceasefire more than a year ago. Israel said it intercepted one of the missiles while others fell into open areas, and responded to the attacks with airstrikes. Lebanon's health ministry said Israeli airstrikes killed at least 31 people and wounded at least 149, most of them in southern Lebanon. Lebanese government, facing being drawn into another devastating war, said it planned to arrest those responsible for the rocket attack on Israel. In the capital, Beirut, residents leaving southern Lebanon and Beirut's southern suburbs streamed into shelters set up in schools, which have been closed by the government. At the Renee Mawad Public School in central Beirut, many of those arriving had been displaced 2 years ago during fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. Families arrived in cars piled high with mattresses and other belongings. Abu Ali, a taxi driver who did not want to give his full name out of fear of being ostracized in his pro-Hezbollah neighborhood, said he left Dahia, a Beirut suburb that is Hezbollah stronghold, with his family at 3 in the morning after hearing airstrikes. "I spent the morning looking for a school, and then I found this," he said. And he and his family were last displaced during the war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2024. "Last time I played in the streets," he said, "the schools were all full, and I couldn't pay rent for a house. The Israeli enemy is an enemy in the end, but enough. We also want to live," he said. Israel continued to wave strikes across the Iranian capital overnight that it said were aimed at security targets. Inside Israel. Since Israel launched surprise attacks in Iran this weekend, Iran has been launching missiles at Israel's cities, killing at least 10 people. 9 of those killed were at public shelter that was hit by a missile in a city outside Jerusalem on Sunday. Another missile attack in Tel Aviv killed a caregiver from the Philippines. Shea Shore, an Israeli in Tel Aviv, said he wants Iranians to be free, but is concerned Israel's killing of Supreme Leader Khamenei might not achieve that. We killed their leader, but the leadership in Iran is not completely destroyed, and within a few months they're just going to come back, Shore says. Next year is going to be the same thing, same story, same kind of war. Iran talk. The White House told NPR that Iran wants to restart negotiations and that Trump will eventually speak with whoever is in charge. But publicly, the Iranian government has one message for the White House. We will not negotiate with the United States. Top Iranian security official Ali Larijani wrote on X early Monday. In another post, Larijani said, Trump has betrayed America first to adopt Israel first. Trump is sacrificing American treasure and blood to advance net illegitimate expansionist ambitions, he wrote in another. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that negotiations between the U.S. and Iran had almost reached a deal, but the U.S. attacked instead. We left Geneva with understanding that we'd seal a deal next time we met, Araghchi wrote on X, but it was Mr. Trump yet again who ultimately ordered bombing of the negotiation table. Further updates. Iran-backed militias in Iraq have also entered the fighting. They fired at a U.S. base in Erbil in the Kurdistan region of Iraq and claimed responsibility for a drone attacking target U.S. forces at Baghdad airport. A drone strike hit a British Air Force base on Mediterranean island nation of Cyprus. According to Britain's defense ministry, there were no casualties reported. Iran's military said it shot down a U.S. F-15 fighter jet. It also said it fired 15 cruise missiles at the huge Ali Al-Salem U.S. airbase in Kuwait and what it called enemy vessels in the Indian Ocean. It did not mention fighter aircraft. Gulf countries have so far largely left the fighting to U.S. forces stationed on the territory, but increasing Iranian attacks are raising on the specter of direct involvement by those states. Saudi Arabia said Monday that it shot down 2 drones targeting one of its major refineries. It said that the debris started what it called a limited fire at the Ras Tanura refinery, but no civilian injuries. The U.S. military said it hit an Iranian warship, which was sinking Sunday in an Aryan port. Trump said in a video on social media that the U.S. had sunk 9 Iranian warships and largely destroyed Iran's naval headquarters. The U.S. military Central Command said it could not confirm those claims. Global crude oil prices surged and stocks fell as the war with Iran entered its 3rd day. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps said it would hit 3 U.S. and U.K. oil tankers in the Gulf. On Saturday, Iran said it was closing the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway vital to the global oil trade. After Israel, Gulf countries that have long been considered as prosperous havens for Western expatriates have received the brunt of Iranian attacks. The State Department is urging Americans to depart now from 14 Middle Eastern countries, including Iran, Israel, Kuwait, and the U.S. embassies in Gulf countries. The U.S. Embassy in Lebanon said it will be closed Tuesday. After airport attacks and widespread flight cancellations, British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper told Sky News Monday that the government was considering arranging evacuation if needed for hundreds of thousands of citizens in the region. Narcomedia, Latinidad, popular culture, and American war on drugs. Bad Hombres. While a candidate for president of the United States, in 2016, Donald Trump encapsulated volumes of border discourse in just two now infamous words: bad hombres. Trump had publicly made incendiary statements about Mexican migrants when he announced his candidacy in June 2015. In reference to those crossing the border, he told a cheering crowd, "They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people." Then, when answering a question about immigration reform in a televised debate with Hillary Clinton just 2 weeks before the election, Trump elaborated on the theme. "We have to have strong borders. We have to keep the drugs out of the country. One of my first acts will be to get all of the drug lords, all of the bad ones. We have some bad people in this country that have to go out. We're going to get them out. We're going to secure the border, and once the border is secured at a later date, we'll make a determination as to the rest. But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out." Although this anti-Mexican and anti-migrant sentiment was part and parcel of his campaign, the phrase "bad hombres" stuck out to many as particularly vicious, xenophobic, and racist. The TV pundits and op-ed writers had a field day, and t-shirts emblazoned with the phrase immediately went on sale. The news cycle quickly moved on, but the sentiment expressed in Bad Hombres resonated for the remainder of his campaign and in part of the president's attempts to build a border wall. For Trump, a key part of the message was that the border control is drug control. This chapter examines discourse on the U.S.-Mexico border with narco-media narratives, showing that Trump's logic actually reflects decades of representational practices that have become ingrained as knowledge about what the border is and what it means. As several generations of borders of otherness in American racial imaginations, marking not only social difference, but also historical inequalities that have shaped relations between Latin and America and the United States. A diverse array of cultural texts that appeared over the course of the war on drugs have depicted the border as a point of entry for illegal narcotics. In some ways, even Scarface and Miami Vice are border narratives in what they focus on importing illegal substances from foreign countries and on what happens when those substances cross into the United States. In both of those texts, law enforcement officials surveil and guard entry points to the country. However, I am interested here in how the U.S.-Mexico border functions within narcomedia, particularly due to a shift in drug trafficking routes and drug policies in the United States, that the border became an increasingly common motif in narcomedia in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Although this chapter focuses primarily on representations of the border and Mexicanness in narcomedia, it is crucial to also address blackness in the text analyzed here. Understanding blackness in text focuses on narcomedia text, an ongoing theme in this book that crystallizes in certain of the texts examined below. In representation, the U.S.-Mexican border, blackness has sometimes been used as a foil against what other racial formations are measured. I do not mean to imply that Mexicanness and blackness are mutually exclusive categories of analysis, or that Mexican is a racial category that functions in the same way as, or even similarly to, blackness in U.S. representational politics. And although I am reluctant to participate in the problematic erasure of blackness in Mexico, none of the texts that I mentioned in this chapter include Afro-diasporic Mexican characters in the borderland. Therefore, it is necessary for me to analyze blackness and Latinidad in ways that are constructed in the media texts themselves as oppositional racial formations. I should note that the U.S.-Mexico borderlands have produced vibrant narcoculturas with distinctive cultural forms, especially evident in narcocorridos and B-movies that narrate the exploits of narcos as they cross a border, frequently celebrating a trafficker as a social bandit. A number of scholars in the United States and Mexico have written on corridos and shown how they function as counter-narratives to hegemonic constructions of narcotics. When it comes to narcocultura on the screen, the People's Church. A cry for greater economic justice rises today from a million lips. Sometimes this cry falls into a murmur. In other occasions, it reaches a thunder pitch, like in Cesar Chavez and La Raza Unida movements. But it can all be heard today across the nation, from Delano, California, to Division Street in Chicago, from Rio Grande Valley in Texas to Spanish Harlem in New York. In the late 1969, leaders from the Armitage Methodist Church in Chicago gathered to draft a theological statement. In preceding months, the church had become embroiled in a public fight against urban renewal. Its buildings had been occupied by the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Young Lords organization, and its pastors, the Reverends Bruce and Eugenia Johnson, had been brutally murdered, stabbed to death by assailants in their home. The case remains unsolved. Shaken by the loss and preparing for the fights ahead, church leaders drafted this statement. As a church, we understand ourselves to be people with a history. We see the process of urban renewal is directed by a few who oppress the majority for the sake of their own political and economic interest. Specifically, we see the poor, especially the Black and Spanish-speaking poor, are denied access to economic independence and security. As a church, we are aware of the limits and possibilities in our community. It is then with this Trinitarian understanding of life and our particular situation that we dare to be the church in Lincoln Park, in the midst of limits and possibilities, being forced to decide on behalf of all men to embrace the mission for the sake of humanness. The statement, which came from a largely white and liberal congregation, signaled the church public partnership in a grassroots movement to dream of new housing and community possibilities for a neighborhood on the brink. In Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, the dream was housing by and for poor people. It was a powerful message made even more urgent by the politics that engulfed it. When the members of Armitage Methodist Church penned these words, Chicago was a city reeling from its urban renewal binge. The assassinations of several radical activists and a progressive religious community on the verge of being dismantled. The city was once considered the center of liberal Christianity, saw its foundations rocked by a new wave of Black and brown power activism. Bold, imaginative, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, not impressed with the church's verbal commitments to the struggles of poor people. To make their point, Latino radicals started occupying disrupting church services in 1969. First in Chicago and later in Los Angeles, New York City, and Houston. These young radicals transformed the churches into staging grounds to protest urban renewal, poverty, police brutality, and anti-Black and Latino racism. Choosing to occupy churches was not a random act. Latino radicals were out to make a point about the symbolism and power they set in motion, a transformative project that temporarily reconstructed the meaning of the church. As a tactical act of resistance, they introduced us to a new church, the People's Church. In each of their 4 cities covered in this book, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City, and Houston, activists not only changed the name of the church or made bold statements like people, yes, cathedrals, no, Católicos por la Raza in Los Angeles. They envisioned a place where the social needs of the community would be met, where Sunday school rooms could be transformed into doctor's offices, and the church kitchen could be used to feed breakfast to kids before school. This program guaranteed that the church was very building itself, was anything but neutral, and was instead part of a larger project to push back against urban renewal, to push back against the feeling of displacement. In every conceivable way, they believed that another church was possible. These occupations and disruptions, their context in the midst of an urban crisis, the tensions they created, and the worlds they imagined, made up the central subjects of this book. In 1969, churches became strategic sites, indeed sacred spaces, where radical groups staged their movements and proclaimed their message of community control and power to the world. The occupations and disruptions took place against the backdrop of Black and Brown power movements. In the late 1960s, that shifted civil rights rhetoric towards a class-oriented, revolutionary nationalism that challenged economic inequality and white supremacy. It was a moment when, as historian Carlos Blanton argued, radical ethnic politics eroded a basic underlying premise of 20th century liberalism. Pluralistic politics in which ideology and national interest subsumed ethnicity. By the late 1960s, it was abundantly clear that the promises of liberalism, the hope that working within the system was the best way to change the system, had fallen flat. Nowhere was this clearer than in the American city, where the urban crisis had wrought despair, destruction, and displacement of the poor and working families. The American city, which much of the 20th century, and especially in the years after World War II, had provided economic opportunities for Latina and Latino immigrants, found itself in steep decline. As the historian A.K. Sandoval-Strauss has shown, federal policies to transform the city and subsidize the suburbs resulted in an urban crisis that triggered population loss, economic decline, fiscal crisis, rising crime, and the racialization of all of the above. This toxic mix resulted in a lack of city services, housing displacement, and the continued criminalization of Black and brown bodies. Caught in the middle of this urban drama were religious institutions that debated whether they should be uproot and move to the suburbs or stay and join the fight to save the neighborhood. The choice was not always clear. Urban renewal policy and programs, as it turns out, posed a significant challenge to Protestant and Catholic churches, many of which found themselves in the crosshairs as neighborhoods changed. But religious institutions were also experiencing transitions of their own. The late 1960s ushered in an era of deep ecumenical awareness and activism that shifted urban religious politics from reconciliation to revolution. This created tensions between a cohort of religious leaders interested in studying theology against the backdrop of the urban crisis, and others interested in closing churches and starting over in the suburbs. In the end, none of that mattered. Whether churches stayed in the city or took the highways to the suburbs, they could not escape the fact that their buildings